Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for another big conversation brought to you by our WIN Lab, one of our teaching and learning labs at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. And our big conversation series consists of thought-provoking discussions where we explore big trending themes in higher education and engage with one another in discussing existing and emerging concepts and seeing where there can be connections. I'm very happy about today's conversation. I think it's a very exciting subject. It centers around pluriform perspectives, and our wonderful panel of presenters who we'll be introducing to you shortly will try and establish a connection between internationalized education and inclusive education. And they will do this on the basis of two phenomena, decolonization of education and queer pedagogy. And what they have in common is that they both decenter the way that we teach and learn. And who better than our two professors of the Hague University of Applied Sciences, Jos Beelen and Naomi van Stapele, to first of all introduce us into the conversation. I don't think they need much of an introduction. They're well-known, established figures in the field. But Jos, he's our professor of global learning at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, also the co-director of the Center of Expertise for Global and Inclusive Education. And Naomi van Stapele, our professor of inclusive education, with a very rich educational and international experience as well. A researcher, a sociologist, and an anthropologist. So a very warm welcome to both of you. And I'm particularly happy and delighted that we're joined by three other colleagues. Lynette Jacobs from University of the Free State, Bloemfontein in South Africa, where she's an associate professor, a researcher especially focused on inclusive internationalized educational opportunities and decolonial research methodologies. She's one of our partners in the Akudu project. And she's joined by Merle Hodges, also very heavily involved in our Akudu project as an external advisor. I think currently retired, but in a previous professional life, a very distinguished career, a long list of many different responsibilities, among which being an academic in science education, but also director of international affairs. And last but not least, Glenn Martinez, one of our student researchers involved in the student branch of our Center of Expertise, Global and Inclusive Education. And also actively involved, and there we see a wonderful picture of him. Thank you, Naomi. That was definitely worth waiting for. And I have to go back to my PowerPoint in a minute. No worries about that. But also, as I was saying, he's also involved in the Decolonizing Collective, which is a network of researchers and liaise to universities such as Leiden University and Amsterdam University. Also very happy to see that Merle, you're able to join us. A very warm welcome to you as well.
The electricity just went off. So,
and we know you're having some connectivity issues.
Yes.
So joining us on your phone, hopefully that connection will be stable enough. Let me just go back to the to my PowerPoint for a minute. And resume where I left off. So a very wonderful panel of distinguished speakers. Really looking forward to this session. As already said, they will lead us first into the conversation, and there's plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. My name, by the way, is Eefke de Lauw. I'll be sort of the host and try and moderate the question and answer session later on in this session. Before we delve into the actual contents, just a few brief household rules. As you know, it's best if you mute your microphone. We're not with a very large group. So in the discussion, feel free just to unmute yourself or just put your hand up, or if you prefer, just type your question or comment in the chat box, and I'll call upon you in the discussion. You've also been notified that the session is being recorded because we'd like to share the recordings on our YouTube channel for the Center of Expertise. That's all from me for now, and I'll hand over to Jos.
Thank you, Eveke. Yes, how did we get here? We noticed that in the discourse on internationalization, as it is happening at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, but actually all over the Netherlands and beyond, internationalization is increasingly being discussed together with diversity and inclusion. And maybe that is because we are all tired of the term internationalization and we are looking for new concepts and buzzwords. As such, I think inclusive education is not new. That's being discussed for a long time. But in many cases, it refers to inclusive mobility, removing obstacles for mobility. But we are looking more at the internationalization and diversity in teaching and learning. And we are a bit more ambitious than saying internationalization at home is inclusive education because it is for all students. Because we know that there are many inclusion and exclusion mechanisms to be found in internationalization at home. Well, at that point, I count myself very fortunate to have close by in Naomi an excellent conversation partner. So we started to discuss this topic, internationalization and inclusion. And we also wanted to move beyond discussing concepts because that is happening frequently. We really wanted to operationalize this in order to incorporate it into the curriculum. And what we did is we zoomed in on the hidden curriculum, and maybe we can move to the next slide, Eveke. So we have very much visible on stage the formal curriculum, the curriculum that generates credits, that's in the study guides, the activities for the informal curriculum on campus and around the campus. But we also have the hidden curriculum, all those assumptions, traditions that we are so familiar with that we do not talk about them anymore and we don't realize that they are there. And internationalization, I think, is really focusing on bringing in different perspectives that decenter that hidden curriculum, decenter the way we are used to doing things, decenter paradigms. And in this discussion, ultimately, Naomi and I came up with the term pluriform perspectives. So those would be the perspectives from other countries, other cultures, other disciplines, and also the voices that we do not hear or have not heard yet. And all those will bring in those perspectives. And the question that we then asked ourselves, is pluriform perspective a useful term for operationalizing concepts like decolonization and queer pedagogy, the two concepts that are central today? So we are now casting our nets a little bit wider, and we realize that we have excellent conversation partners, not only close by, but also far away. And as far as decolonization is concerned, we have Lynette and Merle with us. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. And I would now like to move over to you and ask you how you view the term pluriform perspectives, and if it is a useful term in relation to your views on decolonization of the curriculum. And I understand Lynette is kicking off.
Yes, I am. And Eveke, are you going to share my slides, or are you going to enable me to share because I see it's blocked?
I can share the slides, but it takes the time to upload.
Okay, otherwise just make me organizer, then I can upload my own. will be easier?
Yeah, it's fine. I just need a second to just find the file and share that.
Okay. All right, so perhaps I can just start talking while you do that. I'm Lynette Jacobs. I'm situated in Bloemfontein in the University of the Free State. And I'm just trying still. I don't regard myself as a specialist. I am in awe and inspired by many people that write about decoloniality and decolonizing of the curriculum. So the slides that I put together is very much still my own way of trying to make sense of it. Surely I like the term pluriform perspectives, but at the same time, it should not just become another buzzword without us grappling with what is really part and parcel of it. So in this, I want to acknowledge the people that inspire me beyond my colleagues, of course, sitting here. Robert Morel, Leslie Lagrange, incorrectly spelled there, David Mignolo, Karen Muris, which I will share some work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work, and so many others. Thanks, Avika, if you can just move on. So my first statement I want to make is that knowledge is very territorial, and those of you who know the work of Mignolo will know that he writes about territory and borders, and those traveling the borders and those outside. And I think that is very much part of curriculum and knowledge. So sharing some slides, if you can go forward, with something that is known, namely the world, how the world looks. Just press the, sorry, I did a lot of animation. So Avika, if you can just press the button again. But if you look at the world, that's actually the equator, and how the world is positioned as power and less powerful is very much part and parcel of coloniality or colonialism. Thank you. If you can go to the next slide. And if we then look at knowledge and knowledge production, the world is even more skewed. And this is a study from 2011, and I would urge you to take a look and listen to that YouTube link that I provided, because knowledge and how knowledge is produced and who the gatekeepers of knowledge is very much situated in a certain space. And so my first take on a decolonial curriculum and multiple forms of knowing, whatever you call it, would be challenging this. Who are the gatekeepers of knowledge? And I'm going to use an example. Over recent years, I have found that my sense making takes place in colors and not necessarily in words. Yet time and time again, I'm told by editors, no, please don't use color. Yeah, maybe a little bit of color, but it's costing. So please don't use color. Please don't use another language. So who are the gatekeepers of knowledge that we put into a curriculum? And I think that image, although 10 years old, does give you an impression of who the gatekeepers are. If you can go to the next, please, Avika. Thanks. And if you then, what is very familiar, look at rankings, the whole issue of performativity and the criteria that is being used, and you look at the top 400 universities in 2013, 2014, and not much has changed. You will see where the equator is there, that red line on the map is right here at the bottom, with Australia being included. And I seriously wonder if Australia is really regarded as part of the global south. And South African universities are those three little ones in the yellow circle at the bottom. So this is knowledge. This is how knowledge is produced. This is what is regarded as being good. Thank you. If you can go on. So my question, and I haven't got the answers, is what do we, whoever we are, know? What is knowledge? How does knowledge come about? How do we teach the knowledge? And the question is, whose territory is it really? If you can go on. All right, so I'm grappling with elements of a decolonized curriculum, and this is in no order. In the first place, I believe that a decolonized curriculum should be post-human, as opposed to humanism, you know, white, male, able-bodied, straight. This is the yardstick. If you can go on. There needs to be a connectedness between humans and the environment, be it natural or technological environment. But with that comes ethical concerns and many other concerns. Thank you. Next. But then, and this is what I love, I actually hope you haven't read this article, because then you must go and read it. Corinne Muris wrote an article on the Rhodes Must Fall movement. I'm sure you've heard about it. And what happened on the University of Cape Town campus. And Merle, situating in campus in Cape Town, will share with you that for a very long time, Cecil John Rose was gazing over Cape Town, but in particular gazing over what we know as the Cape Flats, the part where people are living in terrible conditions, partly and largely due to colonialism and apartheid that built on colonialism and was even more destructive. So if you can go on. This is an example of the art. Well, this is a part of the article where she said that at the point where students were protesting coloniality on their campus, and I can assure you that UCT is very much the last outpost of Europe in Africa, where Old Rhodes was sitting, some students covered the statue in black plastic. And then students were given the opportunity to express their views. So this for me is curriculum in action and not curriculum in theory. If you can go to the next one. Then when the statue was removed, and you'll see Old Rhodes being removed there at the back, there was a student of arts that came and became a statue. Curriculum in action. You can't just, and this is for me the link with queer theory, is the link with both being theory and being an activist. So she became a statue for 4 hours, sitting there where Rhodes used to sit. Thank you. If you can go on. So, another button, please. So it's theory in action. But by doing that, and I think this is where Merle and I had a conversation over the last few days, is not being divisive, but building understanding of the self and the others. Thank you. You must just go on as I talk. So a decolonized curriculum needs to be inclusive. It needs to also be international. A decolonized curriculum does not mean tearing up anything that is colonial, but engaging with it and making sure that students can recognize themselves in the curriculum and in the narrative of the interconnected world, as well as in their own realities. So it is not alienating students, but including students. Decolonial curricula should reflect variety of ways of knowing, which is problematic if the territory of knowledge is situated in a particular domain. It needs to engage students in their own learning and being. And I want to add here, and I thought of that just as we came on, it needs to engage students also in their own learning and being across language and language device. Because what we have in South Africa, for instance, is still students learning in English, which is a colonial language. We know that in South America, students are learning in Spanish, in Portuguese, because of practical reasons. But what we're doing at the moment, I'm in a project where we are really trying to promote multilingualism, where we get students to tell their stories in their own language and in language that's accessible to others. And we find that students still resist speaking their own language, writing in their own language, because they are scared to be judged. So, and I'll come back to this point. Thank you. If you can continue, Avika. So, instruction needs to, you can leave it there. No, it's fine. You can go on. Instruction needs to be accessible, needs to make language or knowledge accessible. And if it is a language barrier, needs to transcend that and find ways of overcoming that without being purist. Students need to be able to engage on equal footing with multiple voices and perspectives from diverse individuals and groups. And it's the equal footing that is problematic, because many students have internalized colonial thinking. Avika, you can pause there for a moment. We engaged in a research study where we looked at, and Mignolo was our lens, where we looked at people that cross the borders to the territory of the West, to the global North. And we find that while people go there and embrace that, they leave behind their own ontology. And in particular, they don't consider the epistemology. They import epistemology from the global North because that's what gets them published, that's what gets them accepted, that's what moves them beyond the whole idea of being exotic and other to being accepted. Accepted by who? Thanks, if you can continue. So this is where I am at the moment. How can decolonization of curriculum contribute to pluriform perspectives, a term that I rather like? First of all, through acceptance of the self. You see, if students can recognize themselves in their curriculum, can relate to their curriculum, but not in a deficit way, but in an appreciative way, and they can learn to accept themselves, then I think the curriculum is taking us somewhere. But then at the same time, you can just open all of it. We need to also promote openness to otherness. In other words, to have a African version of a curriculum and excluding other views will not contribute to that. It might lead to acceptance of self, but it will not contribute to openness to otherness. So a decolonized curriculum needs to make us nomads. It needs to make us border dwellers in a space that we can go to with the acceptance of the self and others and explore and learn from each other. And I think that is where I'm going to stop and hand over to Merle, because I'm fully aware that I'm still captured in my own white body, living in an unequal South Africa. And I cannot rid myself of my Western knowledge either. So I hope Merle will come in with her insights into the issues that I'm grappling with. Thank you very much. And thanks, Avika, for presenting. And sorry about all the animations.
Thank you very much, Lynette. Sorry. Can I go ahead, Avika, or will you?
Yes, please go ahead, Mel.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry that I'm on my mobile phone. I tried to get in on my computer, but with load shedding, I think my computer just froze on me. So, look, I think before we started, Lynette and I had quite a number of conversations just to see whether we are agreeing or whether we are disagreeing. And we realized that we are agreeing. And Lynette also sent me the paper of Karen Muris. And I was thinking, when I read that paper, why am I doing this at the age of 70? Am I, punishing myself by reading this article? But the central argument in that article is that decolonization could be seen as a unifying construct. And I think I really like that. So let me get back to Jos's question about pluriform perspectives, and that decolonization can be seen as a voice within pluriform perspectives. I have a problem with that, because why I'm thinking is that decolonization then is, for me, almost like implicit or subsumed into that term. And I think at the point where our students are today is that we feel that it must be made explicit, that they want to hear this term decolonization. So I think we can discuss this as to how we can make decolonization explicit should we use this term pluriform perspectives. And the reason why I'm saying this, that that we were colonized, then we had a phase of apartheid, and then in 1994 we were liberated. But when we were liberated and we asked the ANC, where are we going to with our liberation? Because we're suffering under racial capitalism, the ANC said they will first concentrate on racialism and then later they will concentrate on capitalism. It's almost the same as the Pluriform decolonization debate for me. We're now in 2022. We have a so-called Pluriform government. We have a democracy, but nothing has changed in our country. People are even more exploited than when before liberation in terms of financial poverty and things like that. So I think that is where the student voices are coming from, that they thought they were being liberated and it was almost like a false liberation for them. I also want to come to the term that Tutu used in terms of a rainbow nation. So when Tutu mentioned this term, rainbow nation, it was very romantic and people saw this lovely, happy, colorful nation. But when we started unpacking what the term could also mean, it means separateness, it means silos, it means isolation, it means difference, and it doesn't then say that it is unifying. So I would argue that we need to, and I agree with Lynette, that we should see decolonization as a unifying construct. And fortunately, here in South Africa, we as a group of scientists, we have suffered under separate development. Our universities at the time, I mean, as Lynette said, she's a white Afrikaner, I'm a colored South African. And in South Africa, historically, being a colored in Cape Town, I could only go to one university, and that was the University of the Western Cape. If I wanted to go to UCT or to Stellenbosch, I had to apply for a permit to be specially allowed into that university. And at that time, when we were in the 70s, when we went into science, the Afrikaners wanted to prove that blacks cannot do science. So the methodologies that they were using were excluding us. We did everything theoretically. We didn't do outdoor learning. We could fall over a plant and we would know the Latin name, but we wouldn't know the plant because we've not really seen the plant. And so when we completed our BSc degrees, we decided to regroup and at the time we called it demystifying science. But if we were to think about it now in this era, it is almost like decolonizing science. And that is what we did when we started together. But now we decided as a group to start asking questions about decolonization. And I will tell you the questions that we as a group of scientists started thinking about. And the first question, and it's based on a paper on decolonity of ecology. And the first question that we asked ourselves is, how do we decolonize our minds? And to whom does this decolonization of the mind talk? How do we decolonize our minds in terms of race and racism? Because that was a product of coloniality. And should non-racialism be on the agenda of the decolonization or pluriform debate? And where does indigenous knowledge systems fit into this? Is it better than Western scientific knowledge? Is it equal to, or is it inferior? Then we were also asking the question about knowing your histories and how science can be used to dispossess people of land and livelihood. And how can we then include indigenous knowledge systems as a system that is more inclusive? We also started asking questions about decolonization of expertise. Are we doing enough? What are the gaps that should be filled? And then, of course, what kind of teaching methodologies is required to promote decoloniality, and what kind of skills should be promoted? And here I want to stop a little bit with an exercise that we have done, that I have done just on Friday and Saturday. I had a student leadership group that I was teaching student leadership skills. And in that, I taught them how to do critical thinking through argumentation. And it was quite an eye-opener for me in the sense of the students' thinking, because I gave them as a debate or as an argument that decolonization is the responsibility. I made the statement that decolonization is the responsibility both of the colonizers and the colonized. One group had to argue that we must form a collection and work together as the colonized and the decolonized. And the other group said, no, we want to do it on our own. And it was the most lively debate that they had. The strange thing is that the group who argued that we must join hands and do it together, that group won the debate. And even though the group who said we must do it alone, they did a lot of soapboxing and political emotionalism and things like that. But they lost the argument because the other group had, according to the evaluators, a sort of better argument. And for me, the lesson that I learned from that is that the students are not all politically anti, pointing fingers and so on. They come up with very rational debate around decolonization. And then, of course, Lynette has already mentioned about decolonization and internationalization, how we can use this. And so I think we need to begin to think of decoloniality, the structures that we need to remove, what structures should we replace them with, what systems should we put in place that is equitable and just, and reflect on our own practice and where do we go from here. And then I think I want to end by saying that I don't think decolonization is enough, that we need to think about why colonization happened and what about racial capitalism. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Merle. A lot of thought-provoking questions you raised, and thank you, Lynette, as well, for your very thoughtful reflection on the theme of what decolonization can contribute to pluriform perspectives. I'm sure that's a lot of questions on everyone's minds. But before we delve into a discussion, I also like to give the floor to the other phenomenon of queer pedagogy. And see how we can maybe towards the end find some connections as well. I know that Lynette already hinted at where she sees a connection between queer pedagogy and decolonization. But let's first hand over the floor to Naomi. I'll again share the slides.
Cool. Can you share it? Because then
that's just a second.
So first of all, before I because it's very hard to follow the very rich and very powerful, I would say, what we've heard by the previous speakers without first recognizing their experience, their knowledge, and also the lived experiences, where it comes from, what it talks to. I just would like to, and it might be strange to start with a ginger root. But there is a reason why we start with a ginger root in thinking about how to engage with, first of all, dominance and how we want to counter dominance. So we speak, and I say we, I mean we as a team of researchers, student researchers, teacher researchers, researchers who are outside the systems we have. We work with researchers who are undocumented, in the Netherlands. We also work with youth who are researchers, young researchers in, for instance, Kenya, but also in Nigeria. And we are trying to work on how work on inclusive education. So first of all, education in the broader sense of the word, and also inclusion in the broader sense of the word, and also as a political project. And I think this speaks to what maybe Mel saying before. It's not just about pluriform perspectives. There cannot be plurality without inclusion, and I think that's already speaking to power dynamics at play. And what is very interesting about a ginger root is that it's a rhizome, And this, of course, goes to, and it was a feast of recognition to see some of the authors that were shown by Lynette, for instance, Karen Murs, but also Braidotti. Braidotti works with Deleuze, and rhizome is a Deleuze and Guattarian term. Can you go to the next slide, please? That sort of speaks to systems. And when I say system, we can think of organic systems with no clear beginning or end. So that already goes against sort of the linear chronological thinking that is so ingrained in the Western Eurocentric idea of what is epistemology and what is ontology. So this really tries to work in a different way. And this is also already opening up the possibilities, like infinite possibilities to counter, and I think it was very aptly put, the racialized capitalist, and I would say patriarchal system that we live in, where economics and politics abide by dominant rules, dominant system rules, and the rhizome is about being in between the story. So we work with the theory in action, and I really loved that Murs, her article was already referred to, and we also work with students and we call them students, but who because we also have very different ideas of what education may be, and not just institutionalized. So we have informal educational contexts that we work with in Kenya, for instance, and we discuss both the theoretical concepts that inform our work together, and we develop concepts and methodologies together based on various forms of, ontology, various ideas of ontology and epistemology, and that. So what we present today is the thinking that informs our action and the action that informs our thinking. And of course, Glenn will speak to that a bit more. But one of the ways that we work, for instance, at the university here in The Hague is, and this is why Jos and I came to that idea of pluriform perspective, is in a student-led way, because that also already goes countering both the authority of the teacher, but also making use of all these lived experiences that students bring to the educational moment, where the teacher and learner are constantly shifting spaces, and it's the relationship that should be at the center, and that actually defines or constitutes the educational moment here. So if you think about a rhizome is being in between stories. There's no end and no beginning. It's a liminal space of fluid connections and possibilities. And this is where, of course, also Braidotti and others that were mentioned earlier links already to queer theory. A rhizomatic pedagogical approach builds from a relational ontology, and this constantly changes. And that emphasizes the ongoing process of coming to know ourselves. And I really liked that was already mentioned, the self was already mentioned before. It's about the pedagogies of the self and mutual recognition. And that's, of course, Fanon comes into mind there. And our location in global politics. So it's never outside the structures that try to subject us, but it's always in negotiation, in relation to that, and trying to change that. At the heart of such pedagogical practices is the intentional creation of micro-communities without firm boundaries, whereby teachers and students collectively undertake relational learning journeys and discuss, debate, present, and peer review in small groups, becoming vulnerable together. Compassion is the key word here, and in so doing, become less self-certain and more open to transformation. So we do not talk about innovation, because that's sort of neoliberal educational speak. We talk about transformation, which is also system change. So we are part of the system. How can we transform together? By starting from ourselves in relationship to each other, in a sort of an entangled, endless, ever-expanding we. All come to know each other better in that way. This is our experience in the various projects that we do in this regard. And thus also varying perspectives on global politics are emerging in that educational moment. So all involved also come to know themselves better, because you will be challenged to really question your own assumptions. And then, of course, also the power configurations at play there. Next slide, please. So this is at the heart, rhizomatic pedagogies is at the heart of queer pedagogies. We call them rhizomatic learning assemblages. So and we do not, it's human more than human this is also based on feminism and new materialist thought. That is very, very connected to decolonizing thinking, for instance, also by Mignolo that was mentioned earlier. It has a deliberate disruptive political component, and therefore it is pro social housing. It's for a basic income. Like it has all these political agendas, and it's against any type of hegemony. So queer is about identifications rather than identity. In fact, it's about destabilizing social, cultural, political, all kinds of structures, normatizing structures that work to solidify identities, and in so doing, scoop power towards a norm. So it's really to try and counter that norm through these identifications and against identity. And identifications are multiple, fluid, etc., and open up these lines of flight and possibility without denying the violence of these structures that all impinge on our bodies and inscribed in our bodies. The application of queer theory in pedagogy serves as an inquiry into the nature and workings of normativities. So patriarchy, capitalism, racialization, all these and their connections and how they are constantly in small and big frameworks, are constantly work on our bodies and are constantly reproduced also. And I think that was mentioned also earlier before through, for instance, also internationalization. Sometimes in the student-led pedagogy, for instance, you have to take each other on a journey. Students also have to sort of unlearn through all kinds of embodied exercises that we engage them with. So it's interesting to think of how, for instance, the other is produced through normativities, and this is a reflection, but also an exercise that we often do, and how this is connected to all kinds of processes of stigmatization, silencing. So what do we not see? Who do we not hear? Who's not in the room, etc., and are proscribing them? And how can we then actively encounter such hegemonies? Next slide, please. I'm almost done. So this is, of course, this opens up, so our idea of pluriform perspective, and I think this might speak in a very productive way to the previous speakers, is to open up all these possibilities, encounter all these hegemonies, and what are you left with? Uncertainty, but it's very creative and productive uncertainties. An open-ended inquiring into entangled being. I just wrote being there, but it's actually entangled being with a B if we would go in Rosie Braidotti's way. And I think that's very, very useful to think with. And you can even see that agency is actually a collective. You can never have agency as an individual. It's always relational and therefore collective. Sorry, I made a grammar mistake here. So it departs from lived experiences from our students, the intentionality of our focus and awareness. So this speaks also to even spiritual practices and experiences. It's the significance of nearness. How can we think much more about nearness instead of, boundary and creating distance, and what is ready at hand, and the role of repeated and habitual actions. Because we're so routinized in these normativities, it has to be in habitual actions to counter it and make space for the unknown, the uncertain, to reshape our bodies and our worlds together. And this is the task at hand in education. So I really like this, and then I'll stop. So effective teachers are the ones, as Ronel says, who can say I'm stupid before the other, who are comfortable with a certain philosophy, I really like that word, and who knows without fully knowing why stupidity and ignorance are not antithetical to concepts of intelligence and knowledge. So Glenn, would you like to explain a bit more? And I'm sure we go a bit over time, I'm sorry about that, but how does this speak to decolonization, as we also do, because Glenn and I work together in many projects. So you can unshare, Evika. Thank you so much.
Okay, so to me, decolonization is an attempt at unraveling and disrupting the dominant settler colonial paradigms of knowledge and its production. So therefore, it's also a mode of inquiry that questions discursively established normativities. But also, as we've seen, as you've all mentioned, it requires kind of this excavation of designs and tools from the logic of heteropatriarchal racial capitalism and its institutions. But where does this leave us? Because I find as much opportunity as there lies in this liminal space that my colleague Naomi described, you can also kind of become stagnant in this space of liminality, because where does one go when one can go in any and every direction? That's why I also heard someone mention that word intent. I think that's also very important, because you go where you want to go. And my colleagues have had this beautiful quote, Kinza and Venna, where they said, intention is an opportunity to learn and not a justification. So therefore, I think the colonial efforts and its inquiries and its intent in practice, we must be watchful for it not to become a proxy through which normativities insidiously remain pervasive. So then how do we counter that? By believing in magic. Looking at the metaphorical other, that's why I quoted that there, places and spaces of inquiry such as art, music, religion, where productions happen from the space of liminality. I also am going to quote another artist that has a very poignant quote as well, where he says, or where they say, I use mythology to highlight truth because imagination must find its place somewhere in reality. And I believe that that is a very poignant way of saying that how you can, offers us a lens or a way of looking at liminal thinking and offers a way to embrace it. So decolonization then is not an attempt at knowing, but an attempt at unknowing. And I think a wonderful concrete example of this is the student-led approach, which Naomi just described in our research group, where student researchers don't inform, don't consult, don't advise, but co-create research activities. And my dear colleague Naomi acts as the facilitator, and we students get to actually shape or reshape the institutions. This last part, this delegation of power, or a more apt term would be this relinquishing of power, is an important step in order to effectuate decolonization efforts. Because I think that's also a part where we often end up in this stagnant state. And another example, which they also mentioned in this introduction, a wonderful project that I'm working on, I'm very privileged and delighted to be a part of, is this Decolonizing Collective, where this is basically this community that's kind of taken on a grassroots nature of members across universities, institutions, and borders. And all we are doing basically is writing stories informed by our experiences, our vocations, our passions, and disciplines. So what we're in essence doing is kind of a writing of the self. And in doing so, we're attempting to kind of connect the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual that Naomi just described. And all of this kind of begs this final question, I think, that often is not explicitly mentioned enough, as someone also very aptly put, is what do we want to offer students in academia? What is the nature of academia? And I think these are very basic questions that are yet to be properly addressed in order to establish a foundation for decolonization efforts to build on. So I think we need to look a bit further back than decolonization efforts just now, but start back at this, what are these institutions really, which someone also very poignantly put, and what do we want to offer our students through these institutions?
Thank you so much, Glenn, and I think your words have been well received, as I can see from some of the body language on the screen. Thank you all so much for such an enlightening introduction, be it an introduction that took slightly longer, but considering the richness of what you all contributed, thank you so much. And I'm just very curious also to turn to our audience, but also to the whole panel of presenters, because you've reached out to each other, you commented in between as well. So maybe you'd also like to discuss and come back to some of the earlier statements. I was struck by the fact that, yeah, when Lynette started with your statement of knowledge is territorial, and what is it that we, whoever we is, know, and we ended actually by Glenn saying it's mainly about attempting to unknow. So I thought that was a very nice sort of, the circle is coming back to the start again. So I'd just like to throw open the floor for any questions, any comments that anyone would like to pose. Just go ahead, unmute yourself. I see there's some raised hands. I think Claudia de Germano, because we have two Claudias in the audience today. First Claudia and then Glenn. Go ahead, Claudia, you can unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivike. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you so much for the great wide approach on this topic of internationalization, pluriformism, and the decolonization. To give you a little bit background, I'm original from Mozambique, so borders with South Africa. I left the country when I was still little, and I grew up in Portugal. So my education was Western education. And I kind of understand some of the topics that the speakers from the university. Hello, Lynette. This is something that is familiar to me. I had to follow the standards that have been imposed to me, but exactly what are my standards weren't exactly culturally. Even though my parents want us to be assimilated in the society, I wasn't actually part of the society. I felt the same. So I find myself immigrated when I was 20 years old to the Netherlands. So here I found the work. I didn't find myself like a part of society too, but it was just for work purposes. And now here I am 20 years later, still in the same country. I enjoyed the society or something that approached me to call home. Now, in terms of the way to teach, I think the approach to give is actually looking at the, I've heard the word compassion is not actually compassion, it's more empathy, because all of us, within us, we have a multicultural background, either from our ancestors or somehow within ourselves in our own homes. And I find it that it's a little bit hard to translate that into action when we wanted to apply pedagogical methodology to teach students and to help them to pursue and achieve the best what they can do. So there's a great challenge, and the words some here were quite used, but depending on the context that you are, I think won't be just one word to define either pluralism or decolonization will define everyone, but I think will be used in the different places and meant almost equivalence. This is my approach and the way I actually see it, what has been presented here today.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for contributing that. Maybe does any of the presenters want to react to this, or anyone from the audience? Not necessarily at the moment, but I do definitely recognize the challenge, indeed, as you put it, Claudia, as we find ourselves trying to also fit in a certain institutional structure with certain standards as well, and sometimes that can be quite some tension there. Glenn, I'd like to move over to you. You also raised your hand, so go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask Lynette Jacobs, actually, just purely out of curiosity. On your first slide, you posed a question where I probably misquoted it, but you said, how can decolonization of the curriculum help adopt pluriform perspective? But I'm curious why you phrase it as such and not the other way around. So not how can pluriform adopting pluriform perspectives help us decolonize the curriculum? Just purely out of curiosity.
Well, the answer is not very exciting. It was the question that was shared with me. So that's where I started. And so I think all of this is entangled. I don't think it's necessarily the one contributing to the other. I think what we need to be aware is that imbalances is and remain. And I think conversations such as this and the many others that we have is really, and because there's a lot of labeling in terms of that as well. Not labeling necessarily in a negative sense, but as people grapple with inequalities, they position themselves also in a specific geopolitical space. So I'm in South Africa, I am white, I am woman, I am straight, but I'm a nomad because my people didn't come from here. My mother was German, but not Germans that were in Russia, but they traveled to Russia. They weren't even there. So my father is supposedly, was an Afrikaans white male, but his forefathers came from France and from Scotland. So here I am. I'm finding myself here. I didn't place myself here. I am here. I consider myself as from Africa, but I'm aware of not being from Africa when you look at me, and when I am here and when I travel, I have privileges because of the way I look, and it cannot be denied, even though my government is supposed to be liberating people in Africa, which they're not. And I don't think there's any arguing there. They're just corrupting themselves, and they are corrupt and they're just enriching themselves. So what comes first? Having plural views and different ways of being and looking and thinking and learning, or decoloniality, or any other form of liberating ways of learning. I can't say what comes first. What I know is that power is vested in many structures, and one of them is, and a big one, is how knowledge is produced and viewed. And I always, and people don't like the example, but if I look at the production of vaccines and how many people really were very relieved in South Africa when we actually got vaccines from the West and not from Russia and not from China. Why? Because we've so internalized who is to be trusted. And I'm sure you've seen, for instance, the conversations about, and I'm not in any way disregarding the atrocities that's going on in Ukraine, but how the world is reacting to what's going on in Ukraine versus how the world is not reacting to what's going on in other parts of the world. So, I mean, this is just, it's a messy space, but it needs to be messy for us to go anywhere. So I don't think I've necessarily answered your question, but the short is, Jos told me this is what you need to do, so I listened.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for a thought-provoking question in the end, where the answer seemed to be simple, but in the end proved to be very hard to answer. I'm conscious of the fact that actually it's already past 4 o'clock, but I think there's still some hands raised, and Jos, I just interrupted you. Apologies for that. So I'll give you opportunity to say something in a few moments. But if you have to leave, I fully understand. Then we'll be looking forward to welcoming you to a next big conversation. But if you do have some extra time, I'm happy to just stay around and just finish probably a start of a discussion, if I can call it like that. Jos, sorry, I was interrupting you. I see that Elspeth and Naomi, you both raised your hands, so I'll reach out to you in a moment, but go ahead.
I just wanted to thank Lynette for flipping the question around. It's also not unusual for her to do so. But I think in this case, it really contributes to the discussion to see it go both ways, both using the term pluriform perspectives to sort of stimulate decoloniality, or the other way around. So I think that is something that I take away from this discussion, definitely. No.
Absolutely, yeah. I think Elspeth or Naomi, do you want to first comment on this? So, no, you're pointing at Elspeth. Elspeth, you shared quite a few resources in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evika. Yeah, thank you very much to everybody for an interesting conversation. I know The Hague has relationships with all kinds of things going on in Southern Africa, so it's great to see that coming through. I wanted to mention that Critical Internationalization Studies Network, they are based, it started off, I think, basically in North America, but they're looking very particularly at Latin America. And it's quite interesting to, from sort of somewhere in the middle to see European colleagues and friends working with Africa, and over in North America working with Latin America. So it's quite interesting to see how we bring all of this together. But their particular take on decolonization is also very much linked to indigenization. And so it's generally, they're trying to criticize the way that we've approached internationalization in the past, and the sort of Western hegemonic approach to internationalization. It's a very interesting group, and Sharon Stein in particular has written some fantastic things around decolonization. She works very much with indigenous communities. And I just wanted to point out that masterclass because they've got a whole series of videos on each of those topics I put in the chat. But there's also a range of other resources as well. And just a quick plug, I've got, I may have mentioned I certainly mentioned to some of you that I've got a YouTube channel with various conversations, and Jos was kindly involved in that a couple of years ago. I've got one coming up soon on international educators, students and queer intersectionalities with some colleagues from Australia. And then immediately after that, I've got Sharon Stein talking about decolonization. They're both recorded. I just need to put them up on the YouTube channel. But it's interesting how all of this links together. And I do very much feel as though they're all interlinked. So it's great to connect with you today.
Thank you so much, Elspeth, and be sure to promote your series as well. I think it's great to see that the similar concepts are being discussed in different platforms, and that we can find commonalities, but also see where there are slight differences in nuance indeed. So thank you so much for sharing the resources, and looking forward to the posts on your YouTube channel, Elspeth. Last but not least, Naomi, go ahead.
Oh no, I don't want to have the last word.
There might be a few more hands popping up after your turn. We'll see.
Some group. Let me see what happens now. I really enjoy to see how queer theory and decolonization speak to each other in a very productive way, even though it might mean, also different things to different people. But I really like the fact that, for instance, Lynette had several authors that really resonate with me, at least, and who also make these connections. And I think in the practice, it comes together. And you've mentioned it twice now, Lynette, is the term nomad or nomadicity. And I think that nomad is actually the most queer idea that you can think of, because you can't really fix it. It's always in flux. It's something that's and therefore I think it helps us to think, if we think about nomadic subjects, and this is of course Braidotti, it helps us to deterritorialize. And I think that's also going back to the territoriality of knowledge, and it's about where is it territorialized, where are the possibilities of deterritorialization, because sometimes you need to then territorialize it again, but let's always have that opportunity of it only being very temporarily and spatially territorialized in our minds, so that we constantly do not take it too serious. And I'm not saying that experience should always be taken serious, especially how power impinges on our lives and our bodies and our possibilities, but how the notions and the constructs that that help us in our pedagogies and in our research, we should always question them. And I think that's what nomad and nomadic subjects does. So because it's always on the move and it's always just out of reach. And I think that's I really like to think and act with that. And I think that's where decolonizing, because there's a difference, also speaks to, because we do not want to re-essentialize. We want to go against all the essentializations that are have been part of that sort of governmentality of hetero, patriarchal, racialized capitalism. So that was, just wanted to end with big words. That was my
Well, you were very successful in that, and I think it's also a wonderful way to wrap up, or try and wrap up this very rich session indeed, where we discussed so many different ideas and perspectives. But before we go, I'd just like to thank obviously all the panelists and maybe invite them to say just a few parting words. I think, Naomi, you've just said your parting words, so if you don't mind, I'll skip you. But maybe Jos, Merle and Lynette, you would like to leave us with just a few more of your thoughts or any sort of, ideas that you gained through this session?
Yes, if I may, I'm glad that Glenn mentioned the word excavating. That speaks to my heart as a theologist. And I think we can indeed do a lot of digging in these topics for the next years to come. So also from my side, thank you for contributing.
Super, thank you. Mo, is there anything you would like to leave us with? Are you still muted, Mo?
I need to commend the group for a very, very exciting discussion. I've learned more than what I've shared, and I'm going away with quite a rich flavor of what it is that we can do and can consider. So thank you very much. It was an enriching experience.
That's lovely to hear, and it was great to have you, Mel. Lynette, you said that you said already way too much, but maybe some of your final thoughts for now. I guess there's no closure to this, obviously.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invite and for being here. I honestly think we need to work on better words that bring us together, because by separating the conversations that are actually mutual, we're not joining forces, for want of a better word. And I know, for instance, some of my colleagues, in particular my Black colleagues, they don't like the word decolonizing, because they say even that is a Western word, and prefer to use transformation. So yeah, that's just a last thought, but thank you very much. It was great listening to you, and I do agree that there's more commonalities than anything else within the discussion, and it was great being part of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a very positive outcome, and you did indeed already mention the role of language and words in this. Glenn, last but not least, anything that you would like to share with us before we wrap up?
No, I'm very glad that I was able to share my perspective here from a student. That is oftentimes, unfortunately, still a rarity. But I think this is a beautiful example of effectuating what we kind of talked about today. And I hope this is just the start of many conversations and many more actionable attempts at decolonizing efforts.
Absolutely, and I hope indeed that by including students and other stakeholders in the discussion, that at least we can engage on equal footings. And on that note, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon, and let's continue the conversation. For now, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mo.
Bye.